Our next guest has taken a closer look at the high cost of regulation. We say hello to Sam Batkins, who's the Director of Regulatory Policy at the American Action Forum. So, Sam, first things first, I guess for the record, it's $181.5 billion, the cost of regulation you estimated last year. How did you come up with that huge number?
Well, it's pretty much a matter of addition. The agencies actually provided all the estimates for us. So these are government estimates. All we did was throw them into Excel and add everything up for them.
And what was your reaction when you saw that number?
Well, I mean, it had been building throughout the year. I think we'd actually hit 100 billion shortly before July 4th. So there was a chance that we were going to hit 200 billion. And it sort of made sense because this was, after all, the year of action. And there was actually one regulation that is going to be published in a few weeks, it looks like, another regulation for coal power plants that was released last year but didn't make it into the books formally, that could have pushed us well past $200 billion if it had been published last year.
Sam, as you're speaking, we're seeing footage from last week with the new Republican Senate being sworn in as part of the new Congress, and now a chamber I'm a little more familiar with for the House of Representatives, with Speaker Boehner reelected. Now, for their part, Congress is claiming that it is going to combat runaway regulation, requiring a floor vote for proposed regulations that will cost over $100 million. So they've tried to put a price tag on some regulation, saying that would trigger, I guess, what we call legislative preemption. In your mind, is that enough to do?
Well, it would certainly provide another layer of needed oversight. That I think you're referring to the sort of the legislative veto, which existed in some form a few decades ago before a Supreme Court ruling. The problem, I guess, always lies in the person who's residing in the White House right now, as he would likely veto that legislation. But there are many things that Congress can do, and something that they did in the so-called Cromnibus last year that did address regulatory aspects. So I think what you'll see over the next couple of years is Congress will be able to chip away a little bit. They'll be able to do things through the appropriations process. But in terms of sort of a grand regulatory reform, that's going to take the president to be on board.
Sam, while President Obama talks about using that veto pen and phone to go around Congress, some say presidents of both parties haven't really done much to rein in what we might call the de facto regulatory branch of government. What's your assessment of that?
Well, every president since Jimmy Carter has issued an executive order reforming the regulatory state, looking back at past rules, passing new reg reform legislation. And I think you see every few years we talk about regulation more and more often. So the previous fixes obviously have not worked completely. And part of that is a problem that when you hold the keys to the car and you're the president, you want to drive it your way, so to speak. So it is going to take sort of a fundamental overhaul and a president who's really willing to sort of curb his regulators.
Sam, it's not my intent to get down in the weeds, but as we continue to talk about this issue, I think about the high school civics class that all of us took that talked about legislation. And yet regulation has grown exponentially, and there's really never a discussion of how regulations are promulgated. I've said in the past, we have this de facto fourth branch of government, the regulatory branch. When Congresses, at the behest of presidents past, put in place these executive agencies, they allowed the executive agencies, in essence, to write law. Do we need some fundamental reform? Do you think Congress would ever take on its real constitutional obligation to deal with regulations that have just grown excessive and set up this de facto fourth branch of government?
Well, I think you see a lot of members of Congress who really want to, and I think that's one of the purposes of the REINS Act, to sort of restore that constitutional check. From the agency's perspective, they always talk about, well, Congress gives us this broad authority, and we're just exercising that broad authority. That might be the case in some instances, but there are dozens of recent court cases from judges on the left and the right who have been happy to strike down agency actions that have exceeded legislative power. So the bottom line is the agencies, they view it their job to regulate. And Congress has to step forward just as strong and say, well, it's our job to provide oversight and to make sure that you don't overstep the bounds that we laid out.
So, Sam, do you foresee any changes with this new Congress in the coming year?
I do think you'll see a lot of attempts under the Congressional Review Act to rescind sort of controversial regulations. I think you'll see that with net neutrality this spring, this summer, most likely, whenever that final rule is published or transmitted to Congress. I think you'll see a lot of appropriation writers' attempts on must-pass legislation, and you'll see several bills that will come through that will aim to sort of reform the regulatory state. The Regulatory Accountability Act. There's an act called the Scrub Act, which would form a commission to look back at some of the most burdensome regulations. So the Congress will, I think, be very focused on the regulatory world.
But the challenge you're setting up, Sam, has to do with the fact, and we've got about a minute 35 left here, has to do with the fact that Congress responds to an action. Will Congress ever preempt runaway regulation legislatively?
Well, this is something that an idea we put forward in 2011. We called it the upstream approach. And there was actually a mention of that in recent House leadership action, where in authorizing legislation, they would put restrictions or mandates on agencies implementing that regulation. And that would sort of, take away what I like to call the whack-a-mole approach, the responsive approach to regulation, and make sure that Congress is a bit more proactive with how agencies do their jobs.
Sam Batkins, we appreciate your perspective. I can say from the perspective of a recovering congressman that some of my colleagues on Capitol Hill actually didn't want the responsibility of weighing in against regulations because they saw their job as one of essentially an ombudsman, an ambassador to the federal government, going back after the fact with different constituents and asking different regulatory agencies to reconsider what the intent was. But then again, that really messes with the whole constitutional concept of legislation vis-a-vis runaway regulation. Sam Batkins, Director of Regulatory Policy at the American Action Forum. Sir, you have our thanks. Michael Hayden will join us following this Newsmax Now update.